The year was 1886, and the wind in the Wyoming Territory already had the blade of winter in it, even though the aspens in the low country were still a shock of defiant gold. For Elspeth MacLeod, the wind was a clock, counting down the days since her husband Thomas had been taken by a falling lodgepole pine that spring, and measuring the dwindling time she had left to prepare for her first season alone. She worked with a singular, quiet intensity that the few other souls scattered across the high valley found unsettling. They saw the stacks of rough-sawn planks growing beside her cabin, and they understood that. They saw her splitting wood from dawn until her hands were raw, and they understood that, too. But they did not understand the wool. She was hoarding it, trading precious cured meat and the last of her husband's good tools for greasy, unwashed fleeces from the sheep ranchers down valley. It arrived in great, stinking bundles that she hauled up the track on a borrowed cart, and she did not wash it, did not cart it, did not spin it. She simply began, with a hammer and a pouch of nails, to pack it against the interior walls of her small, two-room cabin, creating a thick, lumpy bat of insulation that smelled of lanolin and dirt and the wild things a sheep encounters in its life. Elspeth was a widow with 2 children, a boy, Caleb, who at 8 years old had the solemn eyes of an old man, and a girl, Fiona, whose 6-year-old chatter was the only sound that seemed to fill the space Thomas had left behind. They were her reason and her purpose, the 2 small heartbeats she measured her own against in the deep, silent nights. The valley community, such as it was, had offered its help in the traditional ways. Amos Kelleher, a man whose opinions were as solid and unmovable as the granite bluffs he farmed beneath, had organized the men to bring in her hay. His wife Dora had brought casseroles and sad-eyed pity, which Elspeth accepted with a gratitude that felt as heavy as a stone in her gut. But when her peculiar project with the wool began, the pity curdled into a kind of worried suspicion. Her work was not the understandable labor of a grieving woman securing her home. It was something else, something strange and obsessive. It violated the established wisdom of the valley, a wisdom built on a foundation of hard-won, often fatal, experience. The first to voice his concern was Amos Kelleher himself. He stopped his wagon on the track above her cabin, ostensibly to ask if she needed supplies from town, but his eyes were fixed on the growing pile of lumber and the bale of wool she was wrestling through the doorway. He was a practical man, and his gaze missed nothing. He saw the way she was forcing the greasy fleece into the gaps between the logs, the way she was preparing to nail a second interior wall of green pine over it, effectively thickening her walls by nearly a foot and shrinking the already cramped living space. He climbed down from his wagon, his boots crunching on the dry ground, and approached with the slow, deliberate pace of a man about to deliver a difficult but necessary sermon. "Elspeth," he began, his voice low and firm, "I don't mean to pry into your business, but what is it you're doing here?" She did not stop her work, only paused to push a stray strand of auburn hair from her face with the back of a dusty wrist. "I'm insulating, Mr. Kelleher." His brow furrowed. "With raw wool? Child, that's a mistake. It'll draw mice. It'll hold the damp and rot your logs from the inside out by spring. And God forbid a spark ever gets in there. This whole cabin will go up like a torch." Elspeth looked at him then, her gaze direct and unwavering. She had known this conversation was coming. "It will not hold the damp, sir. The lanolin will see to that. And it is the safest thing against a fire, not the most dangerous." Amos let out a short, incredulous huff of air. "Wool? Safe from fire? Elspeth, that's nonsense. Everyone knows that." He gestured to the vast, seemingly excessive stacks of firewood she was beginning to haul inside the cabin, piling them not just near the stove, but along the entire back wall, from floor to ceiling. "And this! You're filling your house with firewood! Where are you and the children meant to live? It's a waste of space and a bigger fire hazard still." He saw this as the work of a mind unmoored by grief, a woman clinging to any strange task to keep from thinking. Amusement was a safer position than pity, and he took it. "You mean to live in a tinderbox packed with vermin, smelling of wet sheep?" His words were not meant to be cruel, merely factual from his point of view, the logical conclusion of her illogical actions. The news of Elspeth's folly traveled quickly, carried on the currents of concern and gossip that bound the scattered homesteads together. Dora Kelleher spoke of it in hushed tones to Constance Hartwell at the river crossing, framing it as a tragedy. "The poor thing," Dora had sighed, shaking her head. "Thomas's passing has broken something in her. She works and works, but there's no sense to it, packing filth into her walls." Constance, a widow herself for 10 years, was more reserved. She had seen the look in Elspeth's eyes, a look that was not madness, but a deep and unsettling certainty. She did not understand the method, but she recognized the fierce, maternal determination behind it. She listened more than she spoke, her gaze drifting toward the thin plume of smoke rising from Elspeth's chimney, a lonely signal in the vast, indifferent landscape. The community chorus had reached its verdict. Elspeth MacLeod was a figure of pity, a woman whose grief had led her down a path of senseless, perhaps even dangerous, labor. They watched her, they talked about her, and they waited for the inevitable failure that winter would surely bring. Elspeth heard the whispers, saw the pitying glances, and endured them with a quiet patience that was mistaken for fragility. They did not know that her hands were guided by a principle, a secret piece of knowledge passed down not from the pragmatic frontiersman of her husband's world, but from her own father, a shepherd from the windswept islands of Scotland. Thomas had been a good man, a strong man, who understood the brutal logic of this new country: thick logs, tight chinking, and a big fire. His knowledge was based on fighting the cold, on pushing back against it with sheer force and fuel. But her father's knowledge was different. It was based on observing things that did not fight the cold, but simply endured it. He had been a man of few words, his wisdom delivered in brief, stark pronouncements as they walked the heather-choked hills. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand on her shoulder, could still hear his thick brogue cutting through the North Sea wind. One memory, more vivid than any other, returned to her again and again as she worked. She had been a small girl, no older than Fiona, huddled with him behind a stone wall as a blizzard screamed in from the sea, a horizontal fury of ice and snow. A lost ewe, heavy with lamb, stood stock still in the open, its back to the wind, seemingly unfazed by the life-stealing cold. "How does she not freeze, Da?" she had asked, her own teeth chattering. Her father had pointed with his crook. "It is not her warmth that saves her, lass. It is the air. Look at her fleece. Thick, aye, and greasy with the oils of her own making. It sheds the water, and every wee fiber is a hook that traps the air. She carries her own shelter on her back, 1,000 tiny pockets of still air warmed by her own body. It is the air, Elspeth. Air is the best blanket God ever made." Watching an outcome, he had taught her, was not the same as understanding the principle. The men of the valley saw only wool. She saw a million pockets of trapped, still air. She tried to explain it once to Amos Kelleher on his second, more insistent visit. He had come armed with logic, with offers to help her rechink the cabin the proper way. "It's not the wool itself that keeps things warm, Mr. Kelleher," she had said, her voice even and calm as she measured a plank for the inner wall. "It is the air trapped inside the wool. The fibers are crimped, you see, and they hold the air still. Still air does not move, so it cannot carry the warmth away. The lanolin keeps it dry, and dry wool holds more air." She spoke of it as a simple, mechanical fact, but to Amos, it sounded like arcane foolishness. He shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "Air? Elspeth, the air is what's cold. We build thick walls to keep the air out. You're talking in riddles." He could not make the leap from the common knowledge he possessed, that drafts are cold, to the deeper principle she was describing. His mind, so well suited to the practical challenges of farming and building, could not grasp the invisible mechanism she was trying to show him. He left that day convinced she was beyond help, a woman lost in a fantasy woven from grief and old-world superstitions. Her days fell into a grueling rhythm of labor that pushed her body to its limits. She rose before the sun, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet, and started the fire. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal for the children, the work began. She had traded the last of Thomas's valuable blacksmithing tools for the lumber, and it was rough, green, and heavy. She used a simple bucksaw, its rhythmic shush, 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 the morning's first prayer. Her shoulders ached, her palms blistered and bled and hardened into calluses. She would saw the planks to length, then carry them inside, where Caleb, with a seriousness that broke her heart, would help her hoist one end into place. Fiona's job was to hand her the nails, one by one, from a small canvas pouch. Between the outer log wall and this new inner skin, she packed the wool. The work was slow and arduous. The fleece was dense and tangled, and she had to tear it apart by hand, teasing the fibers to maximize their loft before pressing them into the cavity. The air in the cabin grew thick with the smell of lanolin and raw pine, an earthy animal scent that clung to their clothes and hair. After the walls were done, she started on the ceiling, a far more difficult task. She built a crude scaffold from leftover logs and, lying on her back, nailed plank after plank overhead, packing the space above with the remaining wool. Dust and bits of fleece rained down on her, catching in her hair and eyelashes. Every muscle screamed in protest. Then came the wood. She and Caleb worked together, using a sled to haul the split logs from the woodpile to the cabin. Inside they stacked it, not in a simple pile, but with the care of a stonemason building a wall. The logs were laid in interlocking rows along the entire north and west walls, the two sides that bore the brunt of the winter wind. The stack grew higher and deeper, a solid, dense mass of timber that slowly consumed their living space. The main room shrank until it was little more than a corridor between the wood wall and the stove, with a small cleared area for their table and chairs. The children's bedroom was similarly lined, their beds pushed close together in the center of the diminished room. It was claustrophobic, dark, and strange. But Elspeth felt a grim satisfaction with every log she placed. She was not just storing fuel, she was building a heat battery. She was constructing a thermal mass that would, if her father's principles held true, absorb the stove's heat and radiate it back at them all through the long, cold nights. By late October, the work was done. The last of the wood was stacked, the final interior board nailed into place. The cabin felt more like a burrow than a home. The single window on the south wall seemed small and distant, a pale eye looking out from their wooden cave. Constance Hartwell was the only visitor who did not offer judgment. She brought a small sack of flour and a jar of preserved peaches and stepped inside, her eyes wide with a quiet curiosity. She ran a hand over the smooth, raw pine of the inner wall, then looked at the towering bulwark of firewood. She could feel a strange stillness in the air, a muffling of the constant wind that was the valley's signature sound. "It's quiet in here," she said, her voice softer than usual. Elspeth nodded. "The wool," she said simply. "It deadens the sound." Constance looked at Caleb and Fiona, who were playing a game with carved wooden animals in the narrow space by the stove. They seemed untroubled by their strange new environment. "They say a great deal in the valley, Elspeth," Constance said, not looking at her directly. "They are worried for you." Elspeth poured her a cup of chicory coffee. "Let them worry," she replied, her voice devoid of anger or bitterness. "Worrying costs nothing and changes nothing. The winter will come, and it will not care for their opinions." The first snows came in early November, a gentle dusting that served as a polite warning. Then the sky turned a hard, flat gray, and the real cold began to settle in, a deep and penetrating chill that seeped into the very bones of the earth. Elspeth kept a small, steady fire in the cast-iron stove, a fire that seemed wholly inadequate to anyone but her. She did not try to heat the cabin to a comfortable warmth. She was merely feeding the beast she had built, trickling heat into the hundreds of pounds of wood that lined her walls. The process was slow, almost imperceptible. The logs, cold from the outside, slowly drank in the warmth. Days passed. The valley prepared, men banking their cabins with earth and manure, women checking their stores. A sense of collective hunkering down took hold. And then, the sky to the northwest turned a bruised, unnatural purple, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, fell utterly silent. An old trapper passing through weeks earlier had seen the signs, the thickness of the beaver pelts, the frantic activity of the squirrels, and had spoken of the coming of a reaper blizzard, the kind that came once in a generation to scour the land clean. It arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper. A few fine, hard grains of snow, like sand, skittered across the frozen ground, driven by a rising moan in the pines. Within an hour, the world outside her window had vanished. It was not snowing in the way she understood. The air itself seemed to be turning to a solid, moving wall of white. The wind was a physical presence, a shrieking, elemental force that slammed against the cabin, seeking any crack, any weakness. It was a sound of pure, malevolent power. Elspeth latched the heavy bar across her door and checked the window shutter, making sure it was secure. She lit a second lantern, its yellow glow pushing back against the gray, claustrophobic light of the storm. Fiona, her eyes wide, came and clung to her leg. Caleb stood by the stove, his small face a mask of concentration, pretending a bravery he did not feel. "Will the cabin blow away, Mama?" he asked, his voice a small thing in the vast noise of the storm. Elspeth put her hand on his shoulder, her touch firm and reassuring. "This cabin is strong, son. Your father built it well, and we are safe inside." For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. The concept of day and night dissolved into a perpetual, howling twilight. The world shrank to the four walls of their small, wood-lined burrow. Outside, the temperature plummeted to a level that was no longer a number, but a lethal force. Any living thing caught in it would be frozen solid in minutes. But inside the cabin, a strange equilibrium held. The stove glowed with its small, steady fire, and the immense mass of firewood that surrounded them radiated a gentle, persistent warmth. It was not the hot, dry heat of a cabin with a roaring fire, which would then plummet to freezing temperatures the moment the fire died. It was a deep, pervasive coolness, a temperature that hovered just above the point of discomfort, and, most importantly, it was stable. The inner walls, insulated by the thick batting of wool, were not cold to the touch. The air was still. The relentless, soul-stealing howl of the wind was muffled to a distant, ignorable drone. They were sealed in a pocket of calm within the heart of a hurricane of cold. Elspeth tended her system with the focused calm of a ship's captain. She fed the stove a few small logs every hour, keeping the burn low and consistent. She was not fighting the storm, she was ignoring it. Her principle was being tested in the most extreme crucible imaginable. She explained it to Caleb as they sat at the table, the lantern light making their faces soft and golden. "See," she said, pointing to the stove, then to the wall of wood. "That little fire is warming all this wood. A big fire would just send all its heat straight up the chimney. It would be a waste. We are letting the wood do the work. It holds the warmth for us and gives it back slowly." He nodded, his young mind grasping the tangible reality of it. He could feel it. There were no drafts. The floor was not a sheet of ice. They wore their wool sweaters, but they were not bundled in every blanket they owned, shivering around a fire that was consuming fuel at a terrifying rate. They were simply living. They ate their meals, Elspeth read to them from the family Bible, and they slept, the muffled scream of the wind a strange and distant lullaby. It was a test of faith, a long, quiet waiting period where she could only trust in the principle her father had taught her and in the work of her own hands. On the morning of the fourth day, she awoke to silence. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt louder than the storm had been. The wind had stopped. She rose from her bed and went to the window. Peering through a small crack in the shutter, she saw nothing but an unbroken, seamless wall of white. The snow had buried them completely. There was no sky, no ground, no trees. Only the faint, blue-hued light filtering through the drift that was pressed against the glass. A flicker of panic, the first she had allowed herself, touched her heart. They were entombed. But the air in the cabin was still, the temperature stable. They had food, they had water from the melted snow she kept in a barrel, and they had fuel. They could wait. She made breakfast, the familiar routine a comfort in their strange subterranean world. They were alive. Not just surviving, but living. The principle had held. The air trapped in the wool had been their shield. It was another 2 days before she heard the sound. A faint, rhythmic scraping from above. At first, she thought it was the house settling, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of shovels. Caleb and Fiona heard it too, and they looked at her, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. The sound moved to the front of the cabin, and after what seemed like an eternity, there was a heavy thudding against the door. "Elspeth! Elspeth MacLeod! Are you in there?" It was the voice of Amos Kelleher, strained with effort and thick with worry. Elspeth calmly lifted the heavy bar from the door. It swung inward with a groan, revealing not the world she remembered, but a narrow, vertical tunnel of snow, at the top of which stood the dark silhouettes of 3 men against a blindingly white sky. Amos was in the front, his face red from the cold and exertion. his beard and eyebrows caked in ice. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. He had been expecting to find a tomb. The men had been digging for hours, convinced they were on a recovery mission. They had tunneled through a drift that was more than 12 feet deep over her roof. They expected to be met with a blast of deathly cold air, to find a mother and her children frozen in their beds. Instead, they were met with the sight of Elspeth, calm and composed, her children standing behind her, looking curious rather than terrified. As Amos and the other men crowded into the narrow entrance, the first thing that struck them was the air. It was not warm, not by any means, but it was breathable. It lacked the vicious, lung-searing bite of the air outside. It was still, calm, and vital. Elspeth offered them coffee, and they accepted, huddling in the small, cleared space, their eyes taking in the strange reality of the cabin. They saw the towering wall of wood, felt the placid coolness of the inner plank walls, and understood, in a way her words never could have conveyed, that they were standing inside a miracle of sorts. Amos Kelleher held the warm mug in his frost-bitten hands, the steam rising to meet his icy beard. He looked from the safe, healthy faces of the children to the quiet, unassuming woman who had saved them. He looked at the walls, and for the first time, he did not see a foolish waste of wool and wood. He saw a system, a design, an idea brought to life. He remembered her patient, ridiculous-sounding explanation. It is the air trapped inside the wool. He took a slow sip of the hot, bitter coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. He was a practical man, and he believed in the evidence of his own senses. He had just spent 6 hours fighting his way through a world of lethal cold, and he was now standing in a small island of life that had defied it. He lowered his mug and met Elspeth's gaze. The pity and condescension were gone, replaced by a deep, grudging respect. "You were right, Elspeth," he said, his voice raspy and low. "The air. You were right." It was a simple admission, a plain-spoken surrender of his certainty, and in the quiet of that snow-bound cabin, it felt as momentous as a king's decree. In the weeks that followed, as the valley dug itself out and counted its losses, livestock frozen in their barns, roofs collapsed under the weight of the snow, families who had nearly perished, burning through their entire winter's wood supply in less than a week. The story of Elspeth MacLeod's cabin began to spread. It was no longer a tale of a widow's grief-stricken folly, but a legend of impossible survival. People came to see it, to step inside and feel the strange, steady calm of the air, to run their hands over the wooden walls and try to comprehend the principle that had saved her. She explained it again and again, patiently, this time to an audience that listened with rapt attention. She spoke of her father, of the sheep in the storm, of trapped air and thermal mass. She did not hoard her knowledge. She gave it freely, a legacy from a world away. The next autumn, Amos Kelleher was the first to come asking for her help. Not with pity, but with respect. He asked if she would show him how to line his own north-facing wall, the one that was always coated with a thick layer of frost on the inside. Others followed. The wool wall, or the MacLeod lining, became a local innovation, a piece of hard-won wisdom adapted to this new, harsh land. Families began to stack a portion of their firewood inside, not just for convenience, but with a new understanding of its purpose as a heat sink. The cabins of the High Valley became a little safer, a little more resilient, a little more likely to see the spring. Elsbeth never sought recognition, but she earned something far more valuable: the community's deep-seated respect. She was no longer the poor widow, but the quiet innovator, the woman who had listened to an old truth and proven it in the heart of the deadliest storm in memory. Her cabin stood for another 70 years, a silent testament to her work. And when it was finally, carefully dismantled by her grandchildren, they found the old, greasy wool still packed between the timbers, dry and springy, still holding the pockets of still air that had once been the only thing standing between a family and the killing cold.